The Wasp Factory, Chapter 5, A Bunch of Flowers. I killed little Esmeralda because I felt I owed it to myself, and to the world in general. I had, after all, accounted for 2 male children, and thus done womankind something of a statistical favor. If I really had the courage of my convictions, I reasoned, I ought to redress the balance at least slightly. My cousin was simply the easiest and most obvious target. Again, I bore her no personal ill will. Children aren't real people, in the sense that they're not small males and females, but a separate species which will, probably, grow into one or the other in due time. Younger children, in particular, before the insidious and evil influence of society and their parents have properly got to them, they are sexless, open, and hence perfectly likable. I did like Esmeralda, even if I thought her name was a bit soppy, and played with her a lot, and when she came to stay, she was the daughter of Harmsworth and Morrig Stove, my half-uncle and half-aunt by my father's first marriage. They were the couple who had looked after Eric between the ages of 3 and 5. They would come over from Belfast to stay with us in the summers sometimes. My father used to get on well with Harmsworth, and because I looked after Esmeralda, they could have a nice relaxing holiday here. I think Mrs. Stove was a little worried about trusting her daughter to me that particular summer, as it was the one after I'd struck young Paul down in his prime. But at 9 years of age, I was obviously happy and well-adjusted child, reasonable and well-spoken, and when it was mentioned, demonstrably sad about my younger brother's demise. I am convinced that only my genuinely clear conscience let me convince the adults around me that I was totally innocent. I even carried out a double bluff of appearing slightly guilty for the wrong reasons. So that adults told me I shouldn't blame myself because I hadn't been able to warn Paul in time. I was brilliant. I had decided I would try to murder Esmeralda before she and her parents even arrived for the holiday. Eric was away on a school cruise, so there would only be me and her. It would be risky so soon after Paul's death, but I had to do something to even up the balance. I could feel it in my guts, in my bones. I had to. It was like an itch, something I had no way of resisting, like when I walked along a pavement in Port Neal, and I accidentally scuffed one heel on the paving stone. I have to scuff the other foot as well, with as near as possible the same weight to feel good again. The same, if I brush one arm against a wall or lamp post, I must brush the other as well. Soon, or at least, very least, scratch it with the other hand. In a whole range of ways like that, I tried to keep balanced, though I have no idea why. It is simply something that must be done. Simply something that must be done, and in the same way, I had to get rid of some woman, tip the scales back in the other direction. I had taken to making kites that year. It was 1973, I suppose. I used many things to make them: cane and doweling, metal coat hangers and aluminum tent poles, and paper and plastic sheeting, and dustbin bags and sheets, and string and nylon, rope and twine and all sorts of little scraps and buckles and bits of cord and elastic bands and strips of wire and pins and screws and nails and pieces cannibalized from model yachts and various toys. I made a hand winch with a double handle and a ratchet and room for a kilometer of twine on the drum. I made different types of tails for the kites that needed them, and dozens of kites, large and small, some stunters. I keep them in the shed and eventually had to put the bikes outside under the tarpaulin when the collection got too large. That summer, I took Esmeralda kiting quite a lot. I let her play with a small, single-string kite while I used a stunter. I would send it swooping over and under hers, or dive it down to the sand while I stood on a dune cliff, pulling the kite down to nick the tall towers of sand I'd built and pulling up again. The kite trailing a spray of sand through the air. From the collapsing tower. Although it took a while and I crashed a couple of times, once I even knocked a dam down with a kite. I swooped it so that on each pass it caught the top of the dam wall with one corner, gradually producing a nick in the sand barrier which the water was able to flow through, quickly going on to overwhelm the whole dam and the sand house village beneath. Then one day I was standing there on a dune top, straining against the pull of the wind in the kite, gripping and hauling and sensing and adjusting and twisting. Then one of those twists became like a triangle around Esmeralda's neck, and the idea was there. Use the kites. I thought about it calmly, still standing there as though nothing had passed through my mind, but the continual computation guiding the kite, and I thought it seemed reasonable. As I thought about it, the notion took its own shape, blossoming, as it were, and escalating into what I had finally conceived as my cousin's nemesis. I grinned then, I recall, and brought the stunter down fast and acute across the weeds and the water, the sand and the surf, scudding it in across the wind to jerk and zoom just before it hit the girl herself, where she sat on the dune top holding and spasmodically jerking the string she held in her hand. Connected to the sky, she turned, smiled, shrieked, then squinting in the summer light. I laughed, too, controlling the thing in the skies above and the thing in the brain beneath equally well. I built a big kite. It was so big it didn't even fit inside the shed. I made it from old aluminum tent poles, some of which I had found in the attic a long time previously, and some I had gotten from the town dump. The fabric at first was black plastic bag, but later became tent fabric, also from the attic. I used heavy orange nylon fishing line for the string, wound round a specially made drum for the winch, which I had strengthened and fitted with a chest brace. The kite had a tail of twisted magazine pages, guns, and ammo, which I got regularly at the time. I painted the head of a dog on the canvas in red paint because I had yet to learn I was not a Canis. My father had told me years before that I was born under the star sign of the dog because Sirius was overhead at the time. Anyway, that was just a symbol.